Top 12 historical myths debunked by modern science. What if I told you some of the most famous stories you learned in history class are just plain wrong? That legendary experiments never happened, and the truth about some of history's greatest figures is way stranger than fiction. History is full of myths that have spread so well, they've wormed their way into textbooks. But thanks to modern science and archaeology, we're rewriting the past, uncovering truths that are far more fascinating than we were ever taught. Today, we're counting down 11 major historical myths that science has completely busted. You're about to question a whole lot of what you thought you knew. Number 11. Fossil fuels come from dinosaurs. Let's kick things off with a classic we all heard in elementary school, probably with a cartoon dinosaur on a gas station sign. The idea is simple. The oil and gas we use are the liquefied guts of giant dinosaurs. It's a cool image, but it's almost totally wrong. The overwhelming majority of our oil and natural gas has nothing to do with dinosaurs. It's actually formed from the remains of ancient algae, bacteria, and tiny zooplankton from the world's oceans. Over millions of years, these little organisms sank to the sea floor, got buried under sediment, and were then cooked by the Earth's immense pressure and heat. That process turned them into the hydrocarbons we call oil and gas. Coal is a different story. It's mostly from compressed plants in ancient swamps that existed long before the dinosaurs. So, while dinosaurs are fossils, they're not the fossils in your fuel. Number 10. The Mayan calendar predicted a 2012 apocalypse. Remember the 2012 panic? The internet was on fire with theories that the ancient Maya had called it. The world would end on December 21st. Hollywood made disaster movies, people bought survival bunkers, and there was a genuine fear that time was up. Here's the thing. The Mayan calendar never predicted the end of the world. The whole frenzy was a modern-day mix-up of a brilliant timekeeping system. The Mayan long count calendar is cyclical, just like the one on your wall. December 21st, 2012 was simply the end of a big cycle, a 13th Baktun, which lasts about 400 years. Just like our calendar flips from December 31st to January 1st, without the world imploding, the Mayan calendar was just set to roll over and start a new cycle. There's zero evidence in any Mayan texts that they thought this date was doomsday. It was just a modern myth that got out of hand. Number 9. Everyone in the Middle Ages believed the Earth was flat. It's one of the most stubborn myths out there. Christopher Columbus, a lone genius, trying to convince a bunch of superstitious flat earthers that the world is round. It's a great tale of science versus ignorance, but it's almost completely made up. The truth is, pretty much no educated person in Western civilization thought the Earth was flat after the 3rd century BC. The ancient Greeks, starting with Pythagoras around 500 BCE, had already figured out the Earth was a sphere. That knowledge was never lost. Throughout the Middle Ages, scholars, church leaders, and sailors all understood the world was round. The real argument Columbus had wasn't about the Earth's shape, but about its size. His critics correctly pointed out that the Earth was way bigger than he thought, and that sailing west to Asia would be a much longer trip than his ships could survive. The flat Earth myth only really caught on in the 19th century, mostly as a way to make the past look more backwards than it was. Number 8. California was once an island. Go look at some old maps from the 1600s and 1700s and you might see something bizarre. On hundreds of them, California isn't a state, it's a giant island floating off the coast of North America. And this wasn't just some cartographer's fantasy. For more than 200 years, it was widely accepted as fact. This mega mistake seems to have started in the early 1600s thanks to some fuzzy reports from Spanish explorers. A friar named Antonio de la Ascensión, who was on a 1602 expedition, wrongly concluded that California was an island. It's possible he did it on purpose to undermine an English land claim. Once that idea got onto an influential map, it was copied over and over for centuries by mapmakers everywhere. It wasn't until the mid-17th century, after new land expeditions proved it was a peninsula, that cartographers finally, and reluctantly, reattached California to the rest of the continent. Number 7. The Titanic was famously advertised as unsinkable. The story of the Titanic feels like a perfect Greek tragedy. The glorious ship, declared unsinkable by its makers, sinks on its maiden voyage. But that key detail, the idea that the ship was heavily marketed as totally unsinkable, is an exaggeration that took off after the disaster. Before the sinking, the White Star Line was a bit more careful with its words. One brochure said the Titanic and its sister ship were designed to be unsinkable, while another publication called the ship practically unsinkable. It was a bold claim, but it wasn't an absolute guarantee. The myth of the unsinkable ship really blew up in the press after it went down, because it made for a much more ironic and tragic story. When a vice president of the shipping line was quoted saying, "I thought her unsinkable," the media ran with it, and the myth was cemented in our minds forever. We're only halfway through, and we've already redrawn old maps and debunked elementary school science. If you're finding these myth busts as cool as we are, do us a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel out. All right, back to the countdown. Number 6. Rain follows the plow. In the late 19th century, as American settlers moved into the dry Great Plains, a very convenient theory emerged. Rain follows the plow. The idea was that the act of farming itself, plowing the soil, planting crops, would release moisture into the air and magically cause more rain, turning the so-called Great American Desert into a paradise. Land promoters and politicians loved this theory and used it to encourage people to move west. For a short time, it even looked like it was working, because a spell of unusually wet years happened to coincide with the arrival of new farmers. But it was just a coincidence. Modern climatology shows that plowing land absolutely does not create rain. The belief was tragically proven wrong by the terrible droughts of the late 1880s, and, most famously, by the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Those events showed that rain is governed by huge climate cycles, not by farming. Number 5. Bloodletting was a valid medical cure. For thousands of years, from ancient Egypt all the way to the 19th century, if you were sick, your doctor's go-to treatment was probably bloodletting. The treatment was based on the ancient Greek idea of the 4 humours. The theory went that sickness was caused by an imbalance of these humours, and draining a little excess blood would fix everything. Of course, modern medicine has shown that this was not only useless, but often deadly. Draining blood from a sick person just made them weaker and could lead to shock, infection, or death. In fact, George Washington was famously bled for a throat infection right before he died, losing about 40% of his blood in the process. It took until the mid-1800s for scientific studies to finally prove that bloodletting did nothing to help patients, and the dangerous practice at last started to die out. Number 4. Life can spontaneously generate. For most of human history, people believed life could just appear out of nowhere. This was called spontaneous generation. They thought fleas came from dust, maggots just materialized in rotting meat, and mice were born from muddy riverbanks. It seemed to make sense because that's what it looked like was happening. This ancient myth was finally destroyed in the 19th century by the brilliant French scientist Louis Pasteur. In a series of elegant experiments, he proved that tiny microorganisms in the air were the real cause. His most famous experiment involved a swan neck flask, which let air into a sterile broth but trapped dust and microbes in the curve of the glass. The broth stayed perfectly clear, but as soon as he tipped the flask and let the broth touch that trapped dust, it was quickly teeming with life. Pasteur proved that life only comes from life, a principle that became a bedrock of modern biology. Number 3. Pythagoras advocated for a sun-centered universe. The idea that the Earth revolves around the sun, the heliocentric model, is the foundation of modern astronomy. A lot of people think that when Copernicus and Galileo championed this idea, they were just reviving a theory that the ancient Greek mathematician Pythagoras came up with first. The problem is, there's no evidence Pythagoras ever suggested a sun-centered model. This myth seems to come from a misunderstanding of his followers' ideas. Some later Pythagoreans did propose a system where the Earth and Sun both orbited a central fire, but that's not a sun-centered universe. In fact, associating heliocentrism with Pythagoras, who was also a kind of mystical figure, may have actually made the Church more suspicious of the idea centuries later. The real ancient champion of a sun-centered system was Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed the idea nearly 2,000 years before Copernicus. Number 2. Einstein's theory of relativity was inspired by Swiss clock towers. It's a great story. A young Albert Einstein, toiling away as a patent clerk in Bern, Switzerland, glances at the city's famous clock tower. In a flash of genius, he imagines riding on a light beam away from the clock and realizes its hands would seem to stop. And boom, the theory of special relativity was born. It's a wonderful mental image, but there's no historical evidence it ever happened. The story was a later invention, a simple way to explain a really complex thought process. Einstein's theories were the product of years of intense work in theoretical physics, not a single movie-like moment staring at a clock. He did live in Bern, and his job at the patent office did give him time to think. But the clock tower story is just a myth that massively oversimplifies one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs in history. Number 1. Galileo dropped weights from the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It's probably the most iconic scene in the history of science. Galileo Galilei climbs the Leaning Tower of Pisa, drops 2 different-sized cannonballs, and proves to a stunned crowd of professors that all objects fall at the same rate. It's a powerful story about experiment winning out over old ideas. The only issue? It almost certainly never happened. Galileo never wrote about this public experiment, and the story first showed up in a biography written by his student long after he was dead. Historians now agree it was probably just a thought experiment. Galileo did do brilliant experiments on acceleration, but he did them by rolling balls down ramps. This slowed the motion down enough for him to measure it accurately. A method that was way less dramatic, but a lot more scientific. So there you have it. From ancient maps to modern physics, the history we thought we knew is packed with myths. It just goes to show that history isn't a dusty book of facts. It's a living story that's constantly being updated with new evidence. And as we've seen, the truth is often way more surprising than the legends. What are some other historical myths you've heard about? Are there any you still secretly believe are true? Let us know down in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you had fun digging into the real story with us, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history and science. And hit that notification bell so you won't miss what we uncover next. We'll see you in the next one.